So I want to switch and talk a little bit about some numbers. So when you launched 3%, there were 3% women were creative directors, and your data now says there's 29%, an amazing jump in 8 years.
Yeah.
I love hearing that. But there are other numbers out there, and so there seems to be this data gap, like, one group measures it one way, another way, but there doesn't seem to be real transparency in terms of how we get data.
Yeah.
So how do we create an environment where there is transparency and then a sense of accountability around those numbers?
Yeah, that's a tricky thing. I feel like what my experience has been that when you approach agencies and ask them to share their data as part of an aggregate, they're very generous and very brave because they know they're not going to be identified with any one data point. And that's where our 29% number comes from, is when we did a benchmarking survey of the industry, and I think 30 something agencies participated, and we hit every holding company in every size. But when agencies actually have to do the assessment of just their own realities, which is what the 3% certification program does, a deep dive into your actual numbers, not just of representation, but of your programs, your policies, even the work you're producing and what that's signaling in terms of inclusion. Very few agencies are willing to do that work. But which is regrettable, because even if you don't achieve certification, the diagnostic nature of that experience is deeply meaningful and helps you know that you're applying your efforts in the right place. But I hear you. I do think that you can't improve what you don't measure. And let me tell you, after doing this work for this many years and meeting with so many agencies, no one has solved this. Diversity is not something that is cured. It is something that is enabled and valued and evolves. And I just wish more agencies understood that the only shame is actually in hiding from the truth. Yes, I do fault agencies that hide from the truth. But wherever you are at this moment is just the point at which you can improve upon. And you just got to take that first step.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fear that sort of holds people and agencies back.
And legal departments. They don't want anything that's discoverable.
Indeed.
Yeah.
You mentioned certification. Can you speak to some of the initiatives or assets that 3% has launched over the course of its 8 years?
Yeah, so we launched certification because it was very clear that agencies had no sense of how they were doing comparatively to the industry. And they wanted to know where they kind of sat. I mean, agencies are very competitive, and they wanted to know how they compare to other agencies. Brands that are looking to partner with agencies are wondering who's actually progressive around diversity, who's going to actually speak in a way that more of my end consumers are going to feel seen and heard and recognized. So there was a brand imperative for who to shortlist for your, agency search. And then talent, lastly, talent. Women, where do I want to work? People of color, where should I want to work? Parents, where is their support for parenthood? So certification was birthed out of a desire to give the agency some way to actually recognize leadership around these issues. And it's a very deep dive. It takes about 2 months where we do a survey of all the employees that work there around belonging, inclusion, leadership, and talent. We do interviews with a cross-section of leaders there, and we insist that there be a real mix of young, old, new to the agency, legacy people, parents, non-parents, because we want to get at really what it's like to work there. And then a lot of other metrics around ascension, representation, ascension, how long before people are promoted. Have you done a wage audit? You can't get 3% certified if you haven't done a wage audit. I mean, I think out of the 8 years we've been doing these conferences, the one thing I said on our stage that was retweeted more than anything else was, I said, you cannot claim to value people equally and pay them unequally. And so a wage audit. We started a pledge for pay equity where agencies sign on with 3% to pledge that they're going to do that and make any necessary reparations. So these are all the things that create cultures of equity and ultimately the culture shift around belonging.
Well, that's the perfect segue to the next question, which is, which agencies are managing the evolution of women in leadership and diversity well, And what do you think that looks like?
You know, it's ironic that we're sitting here at Goodby Silverstein for this taping because Derek Robson, who's a partner here, just gave what I think is possibly the most important talk we've ever had at 3%, or one of them. And it was called Why the Future is Female and Why Men Need to Get Over It, which is a pretty provocative title. He brought receipts. I mean, he literally talked about the journey of the agency from its heyday when it was all men as partners, and then appointing Margaret Johnson as Chief Creative Officer, and then eventually deciding to have a completely gender equal leadership team in the wake of a lot of business losses that they weren't talking about publicly, and he did talk about them publicly. I mean, this is a great example of brave leadership. And what the best way to create the change that we want to see is to just create it, and that's what Goodby did. They put a gender equal leadership team in place, and they tracked what happened, and what happened was miraculous. And the last thing he said on our stage was, "My only regret is that I did not do this 5 years sooner." And so I think Goodby is a great example of an agency that had an amazing creative legacy and a lot of, respect in the industry, and quietly was suffering through its own staffing choices, and then was smart enough to self-assess, reset, and now they're really prospering. I also think about an agency a global agency, but the New York leadership team. It's called Forsman and Bodeforce, and Michelle Proda is an especially enlightened leader there, and she and her CEO Guy Hayward have a very unique, almost like mutual mentoring relationship. A lot of open communication. That's exactly what it looks like.
Okay. What about individuals, men and women? Do you look at anyone in particular or a handful of people and say, now that's someone that's figured out how to cultivate leaders that don't look like white men? And you've mentioned Derek and the folks at Forsman.
Yeah.
Is there anybody else that comes to mind?
There's small things that I notice. I remember being in a meeting at Jack Morton, which is an IPG agency, and their chief creative officer was a guy named Bruce Henderson. He's no longer there, but my team was there, and he was there with a bunch of the women on his team, and we were actually working on a project together. And when we left and we got in the taxi, I turned to Amanda on my team and I said, "Did you see the way he looks at the women that work for him? Like the respect, the lack of interrupting, the pride. There was something very palpable about him as a leader, where he let the women run. So much of this is about just getting out of the way, and he was someone that really struck me as someone that gave women power and then didn't try to put his fingerprints on everything, really let them lead, and was so proud. There's a white guy that I think has really evolved.